30,000 years ago, on a frozen ridge in what we now call the Czech Republic, a small band of hunters huddled against a limestone cliff in the Pavlov Hills. The wind, screaming off the massive ice sheets to the north, carried the scent of dry grass and looming snow. These people were lean, their muscles hardened by a lifetime of tracking reindeer across the tundra, and their stomachs were likely empty, as they usually were in the deep of winter. They lived in a world where every calorie was a victory and every gram of body fat was a life insurance policy. For them, the idea of having too much fat wasn't a health concern, it was a fantasy. They were the peak of human performance, biological machines refined by millions of years of selective pressure. But as they sat by their fire, carving small figures out of mammoth ivory, they were unknowingly carrying the exact same genetic code that governs your body today. They had the same hormones, the same hunger triggers, and the same capacity for metabolic disaster. The question isn't whether their world allowed them to be obese, but whether their bodies were already waiting for the chance. If we assume these ancient hunters were simply too active to ever gain weight, we ignore a fundamental truth about our species. But that truth doesn't start with exercise. It starts with the very first members of our lineage, in the heat of the African savanna. Roughly 300,000 years ago, at sites like Jebel Irhoud, the first anatomically modern humans were already navigating a landscape defined by extreme volatility. In this era, the environment was a fickle master. One season might bring a glut of mongongo nuts and honey, while the next 3 years might bring a devastating drought that withered every tuber and drove the game over the horizon. Geneticist James Neal proposed a landmark theory in 1962 to explain how we survived this, the thrifty gene hypothesis. He argued that natural selection favored individuals whose bodies were exceptionally good at storing fat during times of plenty. If you were a thrifty processor, your insulin levels would spike higher after a meal, shuttling every possible calorie into your adipose tissue. When the inevitable famine arrived, the thrifty humans lived on their internal reserves, while the efficient ones who burned through their energy too quickly simply died out. We are the direct descendants of the survivors, the champion fat storers. It seems logical that this genetic drive to store fat would have made ancient humans heavy whenever they found a massive kill, but logic is often a poor guide to the complexity of human metabolism. Even if an ancient human hit a caloric jackpot, their lifestyle was supposedly an impenetrable shield against weight gain. We've been told for decades that our ancestors stayed thin because they were natural athletes who walked 10 miles a day. However, recent breakthroughs in metabolic science have turned this idea on its head. Evolutionary anthropologist Herman Poncer spent years studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. The Hadza are incredibly active. The men walk miles tracking game, and the women spend hours digging for tubers in sun-baked earth. Conventional wisdom says they should burn twice as many calories as an office worker in London. But when Poncer actually measured their energy expenditure using doubly labeled water, the gold standard of metabolic research, he found something shocking. The Hadza burn roughly the same number of calories per day as a sedentary Westerner. This discovery, published in the journal PLOS One, suggests that the human body has a constrained energy budget. When you become more active, your body doesn't just keep adding to the total calorie burn. Instead, it starts cutting costs elsewhere. It dials down the energy spent on the immune system, tissue repair, and reproductive hormones to keep the total daily expenditure within a narrow range. This means that even if an ancient human was moving all day, their body was likely finding ways to compensate, leaving their metabolic account remarkably similar to yours. If movement wasn't the secret to their leanness, we have to look elsewhere. But as the centuries rolled on and humans migrated into the colder, harsher climates of the north, the pressure to maintain body fat didn't just stay the same, it intensified. The farther we moved from the equator, the more we relied on animal fats and proteins to survive the long, dark winters where no plants grew. If fat was so vital for survival in the ice, you might expect to see evidence of it in the earliest records of human self-expression. But a piece of art is not a medical record, and it can often lead us to the wrong conclusions. Around 25,000 years ago, during the Upper Paleolithic, humans began creating the famous Venus figurines, such as the Venus of Willendorf. These small statues depict women with massive amounts of body fat, protruding stomachs, heavy breasts, and large thighs. For a long time, archaeologists viewed these as fertility symbols or mother goddesses. However, researcher Leroy McDermott proposed a different, more grounded theory in 1996. He suggested these figurines were actually self-portraits. If a pregnant woman looked down at her own body, the perspective would naturally emphasize the breasts and stomach, while shrinking the feet. But whether they were symbolic or realistic, they prove one thing. The ancient mind could conceptualize obesity, They knew what a body looked like when it had a sustained caloric surplus. Yet, seeing an image of fatness doesn't mean it was a common reality in the Paleolithic. Even with the thrifty genes and the constrained metabolism, the environment provided a secondary, much harsher barrier: the nature of the food itself. To get the fat of a woolly rhino or the sugar of a beehive, you had to risk your life or expend hours of grueling effort. More importantly, wild foods are inherently self-limiting. If you eat wild game meat, it is extremely high in protein and fiber, but relatively low in the specific combinations of fats and carbs that override our brain's fullness signals. You can only eat so much venison before your body triggers a powerful sense of satiety. In the ancient world, there was no such thing as a hyper-palatable food that could trick the brain into ignoring its own limits. But thousands of years later, as the glaciers began to retreat and the climate stabilized, humans stumbled upon a discovery that would finally begin to crack that barrier. Farming was supposed to be the ultimate solution to the problem of scarcity, a way to guarantee that the tribe would never go hungry again. But instead of creating a utopia of health, the agricultural revolution around 12,000 years ago introduced the first major cracks in our metabolic defenses. In the Levant, a group known as the Natufians began to settle down and cultivate wild grains like rye and barley. For the first time, humans had access to a steady, concentrated supply of carbohydrates. Unlike the varied diet of a hunter-gatherer, a grain-based diet provides a massive, consistent spike in blood glucose and insulin. A study of skeletal remains from the Grotte des Pigeons in Morocco showed that even before full-scale farming, groups that relied heavily on wild acorns and pine nuts began to suffer from massive tooth decay, a sign of a high-carb diet. As we transitioned from foragers to farmers, our total caloric intake might not have always gone up, but the quality of those calories shifted toward the very thing our thrifty genes loved most: sugar and starch. Even with this new abundance of grain, the average farmer was still safe from obesity because the physical labor of pre-industrial agriculture was so intense that it kept the caloric balance in check. But for a tiny sliver of the population, the constraints of the world finally vanished. By the time we reach the era of the great pharaohs in ancient Egypt, about 3,000 years ago, we see the first documented cases of clinical obesity. This wasn't a result of genetics changing, it was a result of social hierarchy. The elites of Egypt lived in a micro-environment of modern abundance. They didn't hunt, they didn't harvest, and they had access to bread, honey, beer, and fatty meats every single day. When Dr. Zahi Hawass and a team of researchers performed CT scans on the mummy of Queen Hatshepsut, they found evidence that she was likely obese and suffered from diabetes at the time of her death. Her body, governed by the same ancient survival mechanisms as the hunters in the Pavlov Hills, had finally encountered a world that gave it everything it wanted, and it couldn't say no. If the pharaohs were the exception, they were also a warning of what happens when the thrifty hardware meets a surplus software. But the real pivot, the moment the entire species began to slide toward a new metabolic reality, didn't happen until the last century. We often think of obesity as a failure of willpower, but that ignores the biological trap we've built for ourselves. In the 20th century, food scientists like Howard Moskowitz began researching what is now known as the bliss point. This is the precise mathematical ratio of salt, sugar, and fat that maximizes the pleasure centers of the human brain while simultaneously bypassing the satiety hormones like leptin. In the ancient world, honey was sweet but lacked fat. Marrow was fatty but lacked sugar. The bliss point doesn't exist in nature. It is an engineered bypass of our evolutionary wiring. When you eat a modern processed snack, your brain doesn't see a snack, it sees a once-in-a-lifetime caloric windfall. It triggers an ancient urgent command to eat as much as possible before the famine returns. But the famine never returns. Instead, we live in a permanent state of seasonal glut that our ancestors might have experienced once a decade, but we experience every time we drive past a glowing neon sign. This leads to a phenomenon known as metabolic inflexibility. In the ancient world, your body was a hybrid engine. It could switch easily between burning glucose from a berry patch and burning stored body fat during a 3-day trek. Today, the constant influx of high-carb processed foods keeps our insulin levels chronically elevated. High insulin acts like a chemical padlock on our fat cells, preventing the body from ever tapping into its reserves. We are, in a very real sense, starving in the midst of plenty. We have thousands of calories stored on our hips and stomachs, but our cells are crying out for energy because they've lost the ability to access that storage. We have become the victims of our own success, trapped by the very traits that kept us alive for 300 millennia. We have to understand that our biology isn't broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. If you took an ancient human from 50,000 years ago and placed them in a modern city, they wouldn't have a metabolic advantage that protected them. In fact, they would likely be more vulnerable than we are. We see this today in transitioning populations. When traditional groups like the Pima of Arizona or certain Pacific Islander communities were suddenly introduced to a Western diet, their rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes skyrocketed to the highest levels ever recorded. Their thrifty genes were so well tuned for survival in harsh environments that when they hit the bliss point of modern food, their bodies accelerated into fat storage at a rate the Western world had never seen. They aren't less healthy because of a lack of discipline. They are more evolved for a world that no longer exists. They are carrying a high-performance survival kit into a world where that kit has become a weight around their neck. It's tempting to look back at the lean, muscular hunters of the Ice Age and feel a sense of shame, as if we've somehow failed the legacy they left us. We imagine that they were inherently more disciplined, or that their natural life made them superior, but the data doesn't support that. The only thing that kept the ancient human from becoming obese was the environment itself. Scarcity was their only trainer. Hunger was their only nutritionist. They didn't choose to be lean. They were forced to be. The moment that force was removed, first for the pharaohs, then for the kings of Europe, and now for nearly everyone in the industrialized world, our bodies did exactly what they were programmed to do. They prepared for a winter that is never going to come. We are the first generation of humans in history who have to consciously fight against our own survival instincts just to stay healthy. This leads us to a disturbing realization about the nature of our modern struggle. We spend billions of dollars on gyms, diet apps, and weight loss drugs, trying to find a way to outsmart a system that was perfected over millions of years of life and death struggle. We treat obesity as a modern glitch, but it's actually the primary feature of the human metabolism. We are designed to be fat. We are built to crave the most calorie-dense foods available. We are wired to move only when necessary, and to rest whenever we can. Every bad habit that the modern wellness industry tells you to crush is actually a deeply embedded survival strategy that saved your ancestors' lives 1,000 times over. The tragedy of the modern human condition is that we have finally built the world our ancestors always dreamed of, a world of unlimited food and total safety. And it turns out that this dream is our body's greatest nightmare. So, could ancient humans become obese? Biologically, the answer is a resounding yes. They possess the entire toolkit for it: the FTO fat mass genes, the insulin-driven storage systems, and the constrained metabolism that prioritized fat over everything else. The only thing they lacked was the opportunity. They lived in a world of limits, and those limits defined their health. Today, we have removed the limits, but we haven't changed the toolkit. We are walking around with a 300,000-year-old operating system that is trying to run a program it was never meant to handle. We aren't failing our biology. Our biology is succeeding in an environment that has turned its greatest strengths into its most lethal weaknesses. Every time you feel that pull toward a high-calorie meal or find it hard to maintain a workout routine, you aren't feeling a lack of character. You are feeling the echoes of 1,000 generations of survivors who knew that in the wild, being too thin was the only real death sentence. The image of those hunters in the Pavlov Hills, lean and starving in the snow, seems like a different world entirely. We look at them and see a life of hardship, while they would look at us and see a life of impossible godlike abundance. But beneath the skin, the connection is unbroken. If you could go back and give that hunter a modern diet, their body would react with the same inflammation, the same insulin resistance, and the same rapid fat accumulation that we see in our own mirrors. We aren't a different kind of human. We are just the first ones to live through the Great Glute. We have effectively won the war for survival, and now we have to figure out how to survive the victory. Our ancestors spent their entire lives trying to get enough calories to make it to tomorrow, and now we spend our entire lives trying to avoid the calories that were supposed to save us. It is the ultimate evolutionary irony. We often search for a secret to health in the ancient past, hoping that a certain way of eating or moving will flip a switch and make our bodies act like the hunters of old. We try paleo diets and ancestral movements, searching for a path back to that lean, functional state. But the secret isn't in a specific food or a specific exercise. The secret was the scarcity itself. You cannot replicate the metabolism of a hunter-gatherer without also replicating the uncertainty and the physical cost of their world. We have traded the occasional terror of famine for the slow, creeping lethality of constant surplus. We have traded the dangers of the hunt for the dangers of the desk. It's a trade most of us would make again given the choice, but it's a trade that came with a hidden cost we are only just beginning to calculate. The ancient human within us is still waiting for the winter, still waiting for the food to run out, and still doing its best to prepare us for the worst. In the end, the story of human obesity isn't a story of modern laziness or a loss of ancestral virtue. It is a story of a biological mismatch, so profound that it has reshaped the very nature of human life on this planet. We are a species of professional survivors who have finally run out of things to survive against, except for our own appetites. The hunters of the Ice Age didn't have to worry about their waistlines, because the world was their personal trainer, and it was a trainer that never took a day off. We have fired that trainer and replaced them with an all-you-can-eat buffet. As we look forward to the future of our species, the challenge won't be finding more food or making life even more comfortable. The challenge will be learning how to live in a body that was built for the Ice Age while we navigate a world that feels more like a permanent summer. We have conquered the planet, tamed the grain, and engineered the bliss point, but we have yet to master the ancient hunger that still burns in our DNA. Think back to that woman in the Pavlov Hills, carving her tiny ivory figure by the fire. She wasn't just making art, she was making a map of a dream. She was imagining a world where she could be heavy, where her children could have rolls of fat on their legs, and where the hunger would finally stop. She was dreaming of you. She was dreaming of a life where the calories were so plentiful that you didn't even have to think about them. For her, that was the ultimate victory over a cruel and indifferent world. She wanted this for you. She wanted the surplus, the safety, and the honey. And now that we have it, we are realizing that the dream of the ancient world has become the metabolic trap of the modern one. We are the fulfillment of an ancient prayer, and we are discovering that the gods have a very dark sense of humor. Does this mean we are destined for a future of decline, or can we find a way to reconcile our ancient hardware with our modern reality? The answer isn't in a new pill or a new fad. It's in acknowledging the depth of the trap. We have to realize that our environment is currently rigged against our survival mechanisms. We have to create our own artificial scarcity in a world of abundance, not because we want to, but because our bodies require it to function. We have to understand that the pull toward modern food isn't a choice, it's a command from a system that is 300,000 years old. By understanding the deep time history of our metabolism, we can stop blaming ourselves for our struggles and start focusing on the actual problem, an environment that is perfectly designed to exploit our most successful evolutionary traits. This realization is the first step toward a new kind of survival. We aren't weak because we want the chips. We are human because we want the chips. The more we learn about our history, the more we see that our struggle with weight is actually a testament to how incredibly well our ancestors survived. They gave us the best possible equipment for a world of not enough, and we are simply trying to figure out how to use that equipment in a world of too much. It's a transition that will take more than a few generations to resolve. But for now, we can at least look back at those hunters in the Czech Republic and recognize that they are not our opposites, they are us. They are the reason we are here, and they are the reason we are the way we are. The story of human obesity is not a story of failure, but a story of a survival machine that finally won its longest war. You are currently living inside the most successful biological design in the history of the planet. Our biology is not an error, but a perfectly preserved relic of a much more dangerous time. We are the only creatures in history who have ever had to fight our own success to stay alive. The ancient world was a place where you either found fat or you died. Today, we have found the fat, and it turns out that the only thing more dangerous than not having enough is having it all. We have finally escaped the cold, the predators, and the famine that defined our species for hundreds of millennia. We have built a world where no one has to huddle against a limestone cliff in the Pavlov Hills just to survive the night. But in doing so, we have triggered a transformation that our ancestors could never have imagined. We have become the first animals to die from the very things we were born to crave. Every calorie you consume is a message to a system that has been waiting for this moment since the dawn of our kind. Your body is not a modern machine, it is an ancient vault that was built to protect you from a world that no longer exists.